As with his most recognizable novel, Soldados de Salamina, 2001, Javier Cercas again places a fictitious version of himself in Las Leyes de la Frontera, 2012, as the character of Ignacio Cañas, or Gafitas. And here you can see Gafitas in the middle, and both Cercas on the left and the director Daniel Monzon in the middle both claim to identify with this character. He narrates his memories of being part of a quote, Quinqui gang on the other side of the tracks, in this case the River Ter, in the Barrio Chino of Girona during the summer of 1978 to a reporter who was writing a book about the truth behind the notorious delinquent El Zarco shortly after his death in the early 2000s. While Cercas recalls his own experience as a youth in Girona, the novel simultaneously develops through the intertextual lens of Jose Antonio de la Loma's cycle of Quinqui films from the late 1970s and early 80s, Perros Callejeros and Yo el Vaquilla, based on the life of the famous Catalan delinquent El Vaquilla, Juan José Moreno Cuenca. And this is again the actor El Zarco. In the photo you can see on the right, El Zarco on the left, Gafitas in the middle, of course Gafitas being a reference to his glasses, and which they all have, and on the right, Tere. And then here you can see his look is more or less modeled after the actor Pirri, who, everyone I mentioned died very young, different circumstances, but you can see the look that he's emulating there. And then of course this is the character who he's based on, or the real life El Vaquilla, who was very, very famous media sensation, okay? On the heels of the renewed interest in these films from the transition period of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the popularity of this novel and the recently remastered Blu-ray collections of the Quinqui films of De la Loma and Eloy de la Iglesia, director Daniel Monzon released his cinematic adaptation of Cercas' novel in late 2021 in cinemas in Spain and digitally on Netflix in the US. In a break from the original films, he opted for professional actors without a criminal history. Several critics, such as Tom Whitaker 2020, have observed that the original phenomenon of the Quinqui films reflects a sensationalizing of the celebration of the newfound freedoms of Spanish youth and over-exaggerated fears of crime and violence during the years of the transition from dictatorship to democracy following the death of Franco. I argue that Monzon's film allows its audience to enjoy the more liberating aspects of these earlier films by creating an homage to this cycle, set in the same time period and in a familiar setting to fans of these movies. While the films of the transition were accused of glorifying violence, high-speed chases, sexual freedom, and drug use, the contemporary film provides more of a nostalgic yet remorseful look at this period through a commendable recreation of its original aesthetic. It is a fitting visual representation of the cinematic novel by Cercas and highlights the complexity of interplay between the written and filmic forms. And just a few images. This is the book. I'm sure there'll be a movie tie-in cover very soon. The original Spanish version and edition, and then these are three different English translations from the U.S. and the U.K. And then this is this massive box set that has just come out, Blu-ray, digitally remastered with the soundtrack only on cassette, by the way. The Blu-rays, posters. A really great book by Mary Cuesta. These are new U.S. editions of the films of Eloy de la Iglesia, the Spanish edition in the middle, and then the posters for the movie in Spain, Netflix, and then these are the movie soundtrack as well. Okay. We have also seen in recent years the appearance of several scholarly texts devoted to the Quinqui phenomenon following the publication of Cercas' novel, such as 2014's Quinquis, Maderos y Picoletos, 2015's Fuera de la Ley, 2020's Spanish Quinqui film, and also from 2020 Quinqui film in Spain. In popular culture, several neo-Quinqui films have also surfaced, such as Carlos Salado's Criando Ratas 2016, which is low budget but incredibly realistic. It was released on YouTube and reached more than 1 million views in the first year, making it one of the most successful Spanish films of that year. In 2018, Juan Vicente Cordova produced the documentary-style Quinqui Stars, and the self-proclaimed Quinqui rapper El Coleta has released the albums Yo el Coleta 2015, a direct homage to El Vaquilla's biographical film, and 2018's Neo Quinqui. Nonetheless, Cercas and Monzon both argue that they set the novel and film in 1978 because the Quinqui phenomenon can only be viewed as the product of a specific place and time. As youth, they were both fascinated and terrified by the Quinquis, who were very much a part of their world. Mary Cuesta of the Universidad Pompeu Fabra organized the 2009 exhibit Quinquis of the 80s at the Centro de Cultura Contemporánea in Barcelona, which inspired Javier Cercas to begin writing Las Leyes de la Frontera, imagining himself as someone who could have been a Quinqui in his youth. He was also inspired by the, at the time, unpublished 25 Years and a Day, 2013, by the Catalan writer Carles Monguilod, who had been a lawyer for El Vaquia. And Cercas also relied heavily on Moreno Cuencas' prison memoirs, Hasta la Libertad, which you can see here. And so that's the prison memoirs in the middle, Hasta la Libertad. Yo El Vaquia is the autobiography from the early years of his life. This is just a novelization of the second film. But good luck finding a copy. There are 2 copies in libraries in the United States. Somehow my interlibrary loan was able to get them for me, but online they sell for close to $1,000 each, which is just insane. I could talk much more about that, but time is limited. So the film Yo El Vaquia, based on that first autobiography, had its own soundtrack by the band Los Chichos, who became really good friends with El Vaquia. Cercas and Monzon both seek to recreate the excitement of the Quinqui phenomenon of the transition period, but the author has commented often that his intention was actually to dispel the myth of the Quinquis as heroes and expose the fact that the mythification was the product of exploitative media campaigns from which the subjects were either unable or unwilling to detach themselves. The author's alter ego, Gafitas, states to the interviewer who is creating the book that we were reading, quote, "I now detest those who have idealized Zarco. In truth, that is one of the reasons why I agreed to speak with you, to dispel once and for all the legends and tell the truth about him," end quote. El Vaquia's crimes from the age of 12 were frequently covered by newspapers, magazines, and TV news programs, and the 4 films by De La Loma from 1977 and 1985, based on his life and exploits, only helped to solidify his status in the star system. In his, and you can see Interview, Pronto, frequently featured in these magazines. In his prison memoirs, Moreno Cuenca declares that, quote, "The masses always create myths, though they later blame you for being the one who has created the character. No man can become a myth by himself. He will also need others to praise, applaud, spoil, idealize, criticize one way or another, and mythicize, but they do not want to admit it publicly," end quote. The first Perros Callejeros film made over 1 million euros at the box office in 1977, and De La Loma had sought out the stories of young Quinquis in the neighborhood of La Mina in Barcelona. He used them as actors, most famously Ángel Fernández Franco, who played the role of Vaquia in the first film, though his name was El Torete. He could not use the nickname of El Vaquia, nor refer to the real name or person of Juan José Moreno Cuenca, because he was still underage. De La Loma also claimed that his intention was to show the true Vaquia and dispel the myths, though his films had the opposite effect and inspired many new Quinquis who imitated the car theft and purse snatching of the Perros Callejeros trilogy. One famous example is that of El Jaro. This is El Jaro on the right, and then the actor who played him on the left. The subject of Eloy de la Iglesias' 1981 film Navajeros, who formed the gang after seeing the first film of the trilogy in 1977. He was subsequently killed at age 16 while attempting to rob a vehicle. The actor who portrayed him, Jose Luis Manzano, was a romantic partner and shot heroin with the director. He also died violently at age 29. Mericuesta writes that the delinquent constitutes the principal voice in the narrative point of view in Quinqui cinema, thus galvanizing the audience's identity with the protagonist. And this is Antonio Flores, the son of Lola Flores, who also died very young. But this was from the movie Colegas. And then here you have Eloy with the actor. Cercas' character, Gafitas, bought everything that was printed about Sarcos' life, watched all TV news reports, and read his memoirs and the books that were written about him. As a youth, he also had an idealized view of Zarco and thought of the gang as the heroes of Lan Shan Po from the Japanese TV show La Frontera Azul. On the BBC, it was called The Water Margin, which arrived in Spain in 1978. A river which symbolizes the border between good and evil divides the population, and and the Robin Hood types on one side must fight against the evil emperor that keeps them there. So this is an image from that show. Gafitas was the only character who was able to freely move back and forth across this border. While Tere and Sarko were both doomed because they were born on the other side, the wrong side of the tracks, Gafitas was able to participate in drug use, burglaries, bank robberies, and other crimes without any sort of punishment. He was able to become a successful lawyer simply because a police inspector decided that he was worth being offered a second chance, implying that Sarko was not because of where he had grown up. It is difficult not to see much of this novel as quasi-fantasy fan fiction on the part of the author, who identifies with Gafitas, a youth who is accepted by the Quinqui gang, enjoys sexual relations with the dangerous and attractive Tere, punishes the neighborhood bully from his youth, and faces no consequences other than a sense of guilt and a debt to Sarko, whom he sees as having sacrificed his own liberty in order for him to remain free. He will represent him as his lawyer in order to return the favor and also as an attempt to gain notoriety. The similarities between Cercas and Sarko and the famous Vaquilla are more than striking. Sarko and Vaquilla were both from Barcelona, not Girona, and had spent time in La Modelo prison before age 16, even though it was forbidden by law. Vaquilla's prison memoirs from 2001 and the autobiography of his youth, 1985, both began as picaresque novels recounting his birth to a father he never knew and a stepfather, Antonio Moreno, who gave him his last name but was murdered by the civil guard when he was only 4, leaving his mother to do whatever was necessary to survive. He was expelled from elementary school for stealing supplies, and his mother, shortly thereafter, left him to his uncle. By the age of 10, he was stealing cars with his older half-brothers in La Mina. Sarko confides in Gafitas that he left elementary school at age 7 and never knew his father. They also killed his stepfather years ago, his brothers are all in jail, and his mother just tries to survive. Just as there were several movies based on the life of El Vaquilla played by other actors, most notably the real-life delinquent Angel Fernandez Franco in the Perros Callejeros trilogy, in Cercas' novel, the films Muchachos Salvajes by fictional director Fernando Bermudez are about Sarko's gang, and there is even a character called Gafitas. He was recruited to the gang as a cover because he appeared innocent, and no one would suspect him of criminal intentions. The actor who plays Sarko in these movies was also said to be a delinquent. The final crime that Sarko's gang attempts in the summer of 1978 is the bank robbery in Bordils. The bank had a time-release vault with a 15-minute delay, which is exactly what happened to Vaquilla when he was a teen and went to prison for his initial 6-year stretch. Sarko gives a press conference in La Modelo prison in Barcelona in 1983 after a frustrated prison break was turned into a famous uprising. Vaquilla was the leader of the uprising in the same prison in 1984, in which prisoners, after they could not escape, spoke with members of the press and presented their demands, and that's here. They released their 4 hostages after the prison supervisor brought them all a large amount of heroin, which they injected on camera using the same needle. The novel also refers to the failed escape from the Lleida Dos prison, with Sarko face down on the asphalt in Barcelona on live TV. Exactly like Vaquilla, they had been chased by helicopters, and he shouted at the cameras that he had a bullet lodged in his back, which he did. This was the most famous TV appearance by Moreno Cuenca. And what's crazy is it happens in the movie 1979 before it happened in real life, and then it's portrayed in the biographical movie. They also presented the movie about Sarko's life, La Verdadera Vida del Sarko in the Peñal de Ocaña in the novel. This is exactly what happened with Vaquilla's autobiographical film, Yo el Vaquilla, directed by De La Loma, narrated by Vaquilla himself from Ocaña, and presented on Televisión Española's program La Tarde with a live performance by Los Chichos. Moreno Cuenca had wanted Yo el Vaquilla to be titled From the Other Side of Society, which seems to have been a possible source of inspiration for the title of this novel. Sarko's wife in the novel, Maria Vela, is based on the woman who was married to Vaquilla for 2 years in the 1990s, Isabel Falla. Maria had sent Sarko letters in prison when he was a media star. She also kept alive the romanticized, idealized vision of Sarko as a noble young man who was brave and generous and condemned by poor circumstances of birth to a life of delinquency. Both Maria and Isabel were divorced and had a young daughter when they met their future incarcerated husbands. In order to be released, he needs to find a job and marry Maria. He viewed her as his last admirer and saw marriage as a necessary step towards freedom and nothing else. Vaquilla had claimed in his memoirs that his wife, Isabel, who you can see here on Televisión Española, was older and unattractive, and that he also married her merely to help his efforts to secure his release, though he truly loved her daughter and even adopted her. Both Maria and Isabel publicly advocated for the prisoner's release, but they became addicted to the fame that they enjoyed as a celebrity spouse. Both marriages fell apart, and Cercas and Vaquilla must return to prison shortly after their release because they were both caught stealing cars. Just before Cercas' death, he told Gafitas about his mother, who still lived in Girona, and his 3 older brothers, 3 Quinquis that he met when he was 11 or 12. All 3 had died violently a decade earlier under the exact same circumstances as each of Vaquilla's older brothers. And quickly, these are some of the images from their marriage, which was very widely publicized in articles about the death of Vaquilla's brother, Miguel or Carica. And he was actually in Perros Callejeros 2. So here's him on the film set. There's a new novel about the brothers of Vaquilla, Los Ugal, and then, yeah, we'll come to that. So Cercas confesses to Gafitas that he is incapable of believing his comparison to the show La Frontera Azul and the myth of the bandits with honor. He does not believe that the only difference between them is the site of the river where they were born, that society is to blame and that he is innocent of everything. Gafitas, quote, realized that Cercas was over. The character had disappeared and the person feebly remained. That Quinqui who was alone, sick and done with, similar to Don Quixote on his deathbed when he becomes Alonso Quijano. The police inspector tells us that Cercas, like Vaquilla, died of complications of AIDS in either 2005 or 2006. He can't recall. Tom Whitaker writes that a member of the Civil Guard set up a meeting in 1975 between the director de la Loma and Ángel Fernández Franco and Juan José Moreno Cuenca el Vaquilla, who were just 15 and 14 at the time. When Ángel died of complications from AIDS in 1991, Vaquilla was asked to make a statement to Interview magazine to confirm or deny the rumor that he was also dying of AIDS. He stated that he and Ángel had grown up together and were like brothers. Whitaker adds that the, quote, the frequent confusion between subject and its surrogate, the real-life self and its fictional counterpart here, only added to the self-reflexive mode of performance for which much of Cine Quinqui would become known. As well as living in the same barrio, both delinquents developed a passion for fast cars and stealing them from a young age. We now have not only Ángel el Torete playing Vaquilla, but also Cercas to add to the confusion. In Perros Callejeros 2, Ángel plays himself, and the actor Bernard Saray is Vaquilla. In Las Leyes de la Frontera, we have a novel inspired by a cycle of films as well as the ancillary media. It is only natural that we now have a film adaptation of that novel, or at least the first half. For Regina Schober 2019, adaptation has to be regarded as a complex assemblage of cross-influences rather than a unidirectional procedure between 2 media within an implicitly hierarchical relationship. It is also worthwhile to consider Cercas' novel and Monson's film as a type of fan fiction that seeks to continue the story by placing the author in it with a seductive role. For Linda Hutchin, in the theory of adaptation, quote, all fan fictions like prequels and sequels are mere expansions of the existing narratives which fans write because they do not want a story to end. She further defines adaptation as a process of creation, consisting both of reinterpretation and then recreation. To conclude, Cercas has observed that he does not write historical fiction, but rather his works are a back and forth between the past and present. The past constantly changes based on our present interpretation. The novel views 1978 from the early 2000s, while the film is closer to the present. The reception of the Perros Callejeros films continues, changing based on new editions, secondary text, fan responses, merchandise, the Cercas novel, the Netflix film, plus all the new scholarly responses. The film, Outlaws, recreates the aesthetic and the spirit of the films just as does the novel. They evoke those stories and characters, allude to and recreate certain episodes, and communicate with this phenomenon of the past from the vantage point of the present. So I ran out of time. Just the pictures that I had of El Torete. The one I wanted to mention, this was another one that it just was released, and I couldn't get a hold of it. And again, it was released in 2021, the biography of the actor's life, and it's already selling for close to $1,000, which is just inexplicable.